Hello everyone. Welcome. Thank you very, very much for being here. We have a really amazing program for you today. It's great to see you in the NSE room as always. And hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 979th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and today I have the huge pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring Michelle Handelman, Jill H. Casid, and Ksenia M. Soboleva. To start off, I will introduce our guest and hosts for today. Michelle Handelman is a visual artist, filmmaker, and writer who makes hypnotic moving image installations that push against the boundaries of gender, race, and sexuality. Coming up through the years of the AIDS crisis and the culture wars, Handelman has built a body of work that confronts the things we collectively fear and deny: sex, death, and chaos. Her work has been widely shown in such venues as San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, ICA London, Participant Inc., Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Broad Museum in LA, and elsewhere. Handelman is a Guggenheim Fellow, a Creative Capital Awardee, and has received many other awards and commissions for her films and multi-screen installations. An artist, theorist, and historian, Jill H. Casid holds the appointment of Professor of Visual Studies in the departments of Art History and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Casid is bringing to completion Doing Things with Being Undone in the Necroscene, the first of a two-book project on form at the edges of life. Casid's artwork has been exhibited nationally and internationally, most recently at Ford Foundation Gallery in New York, Documenta 15, and Styrischer Herbst in Graz. Ksenia M. Soboleva is a New York-based writer and art historian specializing in queer art and culture. She holds a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts NYU. She currently teaches at the New School in NYU. Thank you all so much for being here on our NSE today, and it's with great excitement that I'll pass things over to you, Jill.
Welcome. It's so amazing to see such a fabulous room. I've so many, friends, comrades, favorite interlocutors in the house. I'm really excited to start this new year off on such a high with Ksenia in conversation with Michelle Handelman. And before we begin, I just want to say a quick acknowledgement as a descendant of Jewish refugees from Germany, as well as those who didn't survive. I just want to acknowledge that we are day 6 of the in Palestine, and want to affirm solidarity with the Free Palestine still, and calling not just for ceasefire, but also in naming to dismantle the apartheid regime of our time as a real praxis of love. And also want to acknowledge that I do most of my work from the unceded territory of the Ho-Chunk Nation, and that the Zoom technology by which we're convening this also has its own land base, and that is on the unceded Muwekma Ohlone land, and that without material consideration of land back, the right of return, reparations, and abolition, acknowledgement is, of course, never enough, but it is an important start. So before we begin our conversation on the occasion of Michelle Handelman's part 1 of the epic 4-part project Delirium, part 1, Death, the Breakdown, which is until January 20, an absolute must-see at Signs and Symbols here in New York City. And we have a short 2-minute clip to give you a taste of the important aesthetics of this exquisite film that's been reformatted by Michelle for Zoom. So we'll start off with that and then begin our conversation.
this country, violence and hatred are a particular form of intimacy, a fetish. Maybe violence is a form of rebirth, and blood is just memory without language. Inside, a constant state of desire. We're in the presence of absence.
Thank you, Eleanor. You can start the slideshow now. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thanks to Eleanor and everyone at the Broken Rail for making this possible. Thank you to Jill for that beautiful introduction. And also, I feel that our friendship has reached a new level, co-hosting a conversation. I think we've never done that before. And of course, thank you to Michelle for joining us and for being such a brilliant artist and filmmaker and person, really. I was thinking this morning about the day we met, and I came to your studio to visit your archive, and I guess I'd never heard you speak before. And I remember just being so captivated by your voice. The whole studio visit, I felt like I was under hypnosis. And that's because, you know, I had seen your work on a computer screen, but this exhibition is the first time that I actually experienced it as an immersive installation. And I had that same feeling of being completely captivated, being in a state of hypnosis and perhaps in a state of delirium. So I wanted to start by asking you how you arrived at Delirium as this, how you envisioned this 4-part series, and also I'm particularly curious about the title and the word delirium, right? This altered state of consciousness. And I remember Googling the word delirious for the very first time. I was a teenager, and there was a film with a lesbian plotline, Lost and Delirious, and at the end, one of them commits suicide, which is, like, as a repressed gay teenager, great thing to watch. And so I remember Googling that word, delirious, and arriving at delirium. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for now.
Wow. Well, you know, first of all, I have to thank all of you for inviting me here. Thank you, Brooklyn Rail. And, you know, just unending thanks to you, Ksenia and Jill, who have just really been an inspiration to me and are always there to help me think through things. And it's just great to have both of you here. I feel so special, you know, to have two co-hosts. So how did the project come about? It actually started in 2018, right after I finished Hustlers and Empires. And that's when I started to think about this new project, Delirium. And I didn't know what it was going to be exactly. I just had a feeling. And it was like a feeling that couldn't be described in words. But I knew I wanted it to be different than have a different sort of structure than the type of work I had been building. And I didn't want it to have any spoken language or any text. I just wanted it to be incredibly visceral and physical. And as so many of my works, if you've seen my other projects, you'll know, you know, there's monologues, there's dialogues, there's music, there's lyrics, and then there's these moments within the narrative that take you out of the narrative. And they're either these explosions or, and when I say explosion, you know, I mean that metaphorically and psychologically, like a deep, dark explosion, or a suspended state of being in some way. And thinking about delirium, I thought, what if the next piece I make is just that, just to get inside these suspended states of being in some way, to be inside the explosion, and that would be the entire piece. So I just, started ruminating on it. And then 2019, I received support from Creative Capital to start working on the project. And that's when I really began planning it and figuring out what the structure was going to be. I still really couldn't describe it so well because it's really indescribable through words. It's something that needs to be experienced. And but at that point in time, I started to think about delirium in different states and engaging all of these different ideas of delirium in the sense of being delirious because you're happy about something, delirious because you're out of your mind and you don't know, where the ground is, delirious within the political framework that we find ourselves in, and everything, creating these walls of frustration, rage, anger against what's happening in the world right now. And that creates its own sort of delirium in the sense that you're just step outside of your mind and step outside of rational thought for a moment. And, you just want to scream or lose yourself, do something, which is a visceral response to what's happening around you. So at that point in time, I decided, okay, I was going to attack this project in 4 different chapters. The breakdown, the orgy, the come down, and the release. And so I started to think about those 4 different states of being, creating a bunch of notes. I was so lucky to get Rauschenberg residency. So I went down to Florida to the Rauschenberg residency, and that's where work really began in earnest on this project and creating all of the sounds I was going to use, the gestures, working through all these ideas. And that was in February or end of January 2020. And it was right when the pandemic hit. So I was down there for a few weeks. The pandemic hit. They shipped all of us back home, within this new world we were existing in. And at that point in time, I couldn't work on this project anymore. I just put it to the side. I knew it was going to be a big production, and who knew what our future was. I certainly couldn't plan a big shoot. So I started to do other things. And over the period of a couple of years with the pandemic, I started writing again. And writing was something that had always been a big part of my practice, but something I always felt like I didn't give enough attention to in many ways. And the pandemic gave me this space to come back to my writing, to come back to all of the primary texts that have influenced me over time, and I created at that point in time a trilogy of 3 pieces responding to the lockdown, the uprising, and the insurgency. And they were all short poetic works that involved recontextualizing characters from my other pieces and then writing a poetic text that appears as text on screen. So when I came back to Delirium, like fall of 2022, I just, everything was I was coming back to reality, so to speak. And I was like, all right, well, I need to deal with delirium now and figure out what this is going to be. And things changed so much. And I knew at this point in time, I couldn't give up my writing, that I had to, I had something to say, and that had to be said with words. Yet I still had my original plan, and which was very important to me, to have the piece speak without words and to be engaged in this very visceral cinematic installation that would be a really visceral experience for the viewer. And so that's when I just started to formulate a new way to sort of bring these disparate thought these disparate structures together in a way where one wouldn't overpower the other. How am I going to introduce text now and spoken word without it taking away from this very visceral soundscape and gestural scape that I was creating? And then I also knew, that the big project, and so Delirium in its entirety, when it's finished, will be a 90-minute live cinematic installation and performance with live dancers and musicians. And the piece that's shown at Signs and Symbols right now is just like a taste of the first chapter of what people will see. And I expect to complete the whole piece by late 2025, probably, hopefully.
Well, we can't wait for the full experience, but this is, maybe speaking for myself, quite a delicious and heady, even frankly intoxicating taste that feels deeply integrated. The process conversation that we've started about how you came to this and thinking about how to do what you do so well in so many of the previous works of using spoken word narration in a particular way, and how to do that lightly here, so that it's not only deeply involved in the soundscape, but you get another side of those words. You get the body of breath, and as you put it, these guttural sounds of an expressiveness that isn't directly words. And so I was wanting to ask you, since you have started this 4-part project, Delirium, with breakdown, if we could talk about breakdown conceptually, but also as a technique for getting to that viscera that's so important to you. So the breakdown of bodies, systems, but also arguably boundaries with the viewer or spectator. I know that you talk about how the work envisages altered states of consciousness as a means of resisting capitalist ideals of production, transfiguring the body and interrogating desire through a visceral cinematic framework that refuses the production of meaning. But that isn't just a framework. It feels like there's a breakdown is doing something really important for you as a formal technique and an aesthetics that maybe even relates to what's been a animating principle kind of throughout your career of the ways that you talk about how Hélène Cixous's ideas of visceral feminism have been important to you, the ways that you talk about aggressively traversing the corporeal landscape in its various forms of excess and undress, while simultaneously giving it up for the viewer and an overflow of visual and psychological sensations. And that's a much earlier description of your work, but I feel like that that overflow is happening here and by a breakdown that I'd love to hear you talk about.
It's so interesting right now to sit here and hear you read text that I've written about to describe my work over the decades, actually. And it makes me, it clarifies this difference between writing and making. And writing about my work is one thing, and it's a great poetic and intellectual dive into things I'm thinking at the time. And then making the work is also a poetic and intellectual dive, but it's not with a key, it's not with letters and sentences and paragraphs. It's with sound and bodies and gestures and light. And speaking about what you're asking about the breakdown with this section is called part 1, death, the breakdown. Thinking about death, normally one thinks about death as the end. In this case, thinking about death not as a final place, but as a process, as a place you travel through. And if you've been around people who are dying, and some people who are dying over prolonged periods of time, you understand that, death may be the event, but dying is a long, complicated, well, it might not be long, but it is a complicated and multi-layered process. And so the breakdown that happens in relationship to death is a shedding. I mean, this is how I think about it, in terms of it being the shedding of the ego, the shedding of information, the shedding of things that are just no longer important in one's life, and getting to the core of what's important. And a friend of mine who had one of the most beautiful deaths I've ever experienced or witnessed, I remember he said to me when he was in hospice, he said, it's so wonderful dying because all that's left is love. And, I will never forget that moment. It was just so moving. And so, I mean, that's an understatement really to say it was so moving, but thinking, when you break down something, you get more, There's all these particles, there's all these pieces, and things start to disseminate, whether we're talking physically or, symbolically in some way. And as these things disseminate, they start to create new forms. And for me, that's what the breakdown is. And that's why I started with death. Well, that's one of the reasons I started in shooting this project, dealing with death and the breakdown, because it's generative. And that new forms come out of that. So yeah, I think maybe we might want to talk about Lydia and how Lydia became part of death, if that's okay. Is that okay?
That was
if
actually that was actually going to be
Please,
my next
yes.
question. How you decided to work with Lydia, to center Lydia lunch?
Yeah, because Lydia is, Lydia is someone I've known for decades. We've been in the same circles and same orbits, but it's only in the last 5 or 6 years probably that we've gotten to be good friends. And when I originally started this project and thinking about this project, Lydia was not on my radar to do this. In fact, when I started out, I really just imagined dancers and light, and of course, sound in some way. But light, which is something we should talk about as well, is a very important part of the work. And the light is really has an agency throughout it. So
my next question is about light.
Okay.
So just we're
right there on the
we're in
same
sync.
wavelength. So yeah, so as I said, I put the project aside during the pandemic, and what also happens is I lost 4 people I was very close with, kind of one after the other, and they were all complicated in their own ways, which I won't go into, and devastating, really. And it was very difficult for me. Even I kept trying to, like, all right, time to work on Delirium, time to get back into this project. I kept trying to do that multiple times, and I just couldn't find the inspiration. I couldn't find the urgency, and you need an urgency to make good work, it has to be there. And I was just lost. And so Lydia was one of the people during the pandemic, actually, a handful of people that I was in touch with, and periodically, we'd be texting or emailing. And every conversation with Lydia was always talking about writers that inspired us and we felt were very crucial to our work. And Lydia turned me on to the Romanian philosopher E.M. Caron. Americans sometimes pronounce his name as Ciaran. And I had never heard of him before. So I just started to devour everything I could find from him. And he writes these aphorisms. You know, he was writing he lived a long life, and he was writing primarily starting in the 1930s up until he died, which I believe was in the early 90s. And his writing is so doom and gloom, but it's so doom and gloom that it's hilarious. I mean, you just know he is laughing his ass off while he's writing these texts, but they're super heavy, and they're very existential. Like, what's the point? You know, why are we here? Why don't you just kill yourself? It would be easier, you know? And yet, you know, he certainly doesn't kill himself. He just keeps writing and writing and writing. And so, he became a key for me, his words. And that's when I knew. And Lydia, you know, at some point in the past 10 years or so, you know, Lydia, and when we were talking, she had said to me, she goes, I love your work. I want to be in it. You know, if you ever have a role for me, let me know. I'll do anything you say. And so that was always in the back of my head, to do something with Lydia. But the challenge when you work with someone like Lydia, who is such an icon and has such a strong personality, and, you know, very much is not just a strong personality, but she is this, you know, larger than life persona. It's always a challenge to work with someone like that, because how do you shift them? You know, how do you shift that center and still keep Lydia, but have it be my work and not Lydia's, you know, not just a platform for Lydia's work. So I've always thought about working with her, but, you know, had never really thought of the right time. And then, you know, looking for this inspiration to get started back on this project, and thinking about, I'm going to have to deal with death right away because this is my world. It just hit me. And I think I might have been talking to my friend Aline Mayer, who is an artist based in Los Angeles, who was part of the East Village scene back in the 80s. And she's like, why don't you do something with Lydia? You know, like, the two of you are perfect for each other. And then I just thought, you know, oh my God, yeah, that would be fun. You know, that would give me a reason to get out of bed, to get excited about hanging out with Lydia and doing something together. And it makes perfect sense in relationship to this piece. So that's how working with Lydia came about, you know. And so then I asked her, and that was fall of 2022. And she's like, yeah, of course. And I told her she really didn't have to do anything. I was going to write a monologue for her. And, you know, she just needs to, you know, we'll do a couple of costume fittings, and then she just needs to show up on set, and I'll tell her what to do, and that she would have to interact with a bunch of different materials in some way. She was totally on board, trusted me. She gave me all of this material. She's like, here, use anything, you know. So she gave me all these recordings and writings, and I knew I didn't want to use any of her music, you know, because it needed this to be transformative. As I said, it wasn't going to be a music video for Lydia. It wasn't going to be just another one of her spoken word performances, which, you know, which I love, but this was something different. And I ended up, you know, just taking all that in and taking in a lot of other stuff. And there's a few lines that you hear within the piece that are from Lydia, like, the war is never over. That's something Lydia says all the time. She's been saying that in her spoken word performances for ages. So the war is never over comes out. Trust the witch is something that Lydia says a lot in her performances. So that's another line from Lydia. But pretty much everything else is, you know, it was really written by me, and then this amalgamation of all of these different inspirational texts, from Audre Lorde to E.M. Coran to Lydia, you know, and Pasolini, who's always there, and, you know, and of course, all my own words. So then we shot in April of 2023. And then there was the struggle. I mean, there's a lot more, but just to kind of wrap this up. Then I shot with the dancers in August of 2023. Then I had some surgery. It was all kind of crazy. And then as I was recovering from my surgery, that's when I started to really edit the piece. And I had like 2 months to pull it together before the show. And the struggle really was, how am I going to introduce this text without it overpowering the performative imagery? And how am I going to keep Lydia's voice in here? Because you don't work with Lydia lunch and not use her voice, like her voice is so incredible. But to me, it wasn't so much about the words. I really wanted her breath, and that this breath was in a way related to what you talked about before, the breakdown. Because when you break down language, what's left is breath and silence. And so breath and silence became important in this piece, but mostly breath. And, if anyone's seen the piece, they'll know it's the core of this work. So in the end, I kept editing and I kept taking away any footage of Lydia delivering the text and just keeping the words. And then at some point, I realized that I needed to keep these words, that there was this political, poetic framework that had to set up the piece. And so I kept that as the prologue, really. So there's like a 3-minute prologue of smoke and abstractions and Lydia's monologue. And then once that prologue's over, we sort of get into the viscera of the piece and the breath, and getting inside this constant, unending state of delirium. And the short clip we saw at the very beginning of this talk is the only time that appears right in the middle. And it's the only time we see Lydia's face in sync with the words that she says.
Michelle, it's so interesting. The 2 sentences that you pointed out are the 2 sentences that I had written down, because the very first part of the film is make space to think about that which has died, trust the witch. And I thought that it was such a wonderful play of language, trust the witch, because I interpreted as trust that which has died. But then I was like, oh, or maybe she's talking about like a witch. And then we have lost the option of silence because the war is never over, right? And I was thinking, what is the antonym to silence? Is the antonym to silence speech, discourse, or is it noise? And is it this cacophony? That's the other thing that you say at some point, the cacophony of grief, or that you wrote. And I want to talk a little bit about that as well, but I also know that Jill has a question about light.
Well, do you mind, Jill, if we deal with this first?
Not at all.
Yeah. The cacophony of grief, when I wrote that was kind of, taped up to my screen the whole time. And that was really the starting point for dealing with death and the breakdown, like this cacophony of grief, which is all of those things you talk about. There's the conversation about someone who died, these things that happen around death that are kind of meaningless, and they just become these, like conversations and words going in and out of your head because you're in this altered state at that point in time. And then there's also the cacophony of grief in the sense of that sound that's going on inside your head, when you're alone, and you're dealing with such harsh grief. Like, what is that sound? That's that inner screaming, the rage, the tears, all of that really makes a sound inside you. And and it's indescribable. And of course it's different for everyone, but that also to me was the cacophony of grief. And these were the things, that I was trying, that I was trying to bring to an image. How am I going to visualize these things? Because they're so intangible. You can touch them, but only for a moment, because as soon as you touch them inside, they change into something else. And they're just so much in flux and malleable, and elusive. So that was really something I kept reminding myself of the whole time. Like, how am I going to visualize this feeling in some way? And I knew I could only do it through, yes, that gestures were a part of it. And of course, sound which is so important in my work. Sound is the great emotional content of any film in any form. Everything changes because of the sound that you use. That's always one of my favorite assignments to give my students. They'll edit something with a soundtrack, and then I'll say, okay, now you edit that same clip you did and change the sound completely, just so you can see how much sound carries the emotion and changes everything. So, but in addition to sound, I knew light was key, because light is, this is going to sound kind of corny, but I guess, like light is life in a way, just like breath is light. And even if you are a person who does not have sight, there's an experience of light that encompasses sound. And editing, so the addition of, not only the way I use flickering and strobe lights within the set while I was shooting, but in the editing process, I added a lot of lights, a lot of flicker, in a way that wasn't just for a visual effect, but somehow carries this emotive resonance and became a character in this world of grief and death, because I think it is just as strong as anything else, the way light changes and flickers when we are dealing with, with horrendous experiences that sort of excavate us from the inside out, excavate us emotionally and intellectually. Sometimes all that's left is light and sound. So, yeah, that was part of the original. That was part of the necessity for using light and the way that I use light here.
Well, it sounds a little bit like we may have covered a bit of what I was after with the question I was planning to ask about light, but I think there's a little bit more that I'd like to press there, if I might, that has to do with the interview that you just was released in Filmmaker magazine, an interview with Scott Macaulay, with whom you've had a previous conversation. And he asked you to talk a little bit about the particular quote from the work of French semiotician Roland Barthes. You quote Barthes on the death of the author, but kind of quite delightfully, you said, oh, but that actually reminds me of another line from Barthes that I've been thinking about more, and that was, you said, important to the project, which is a phrase that comes from Barthes' little piece in Mythologies on wrestling, which might not seem like the most obvious spectacle here, but I actually think does speak to the elemental forces at work here, that an effort of dealing with breakdown, but and also using breakdown in a particularly forceful, even aggressive way. But I wondered about this line, which is a light without shadow generates an emotion without reserve, in that what's so exciting for those of you who've gone to see the installation, among other moves that you've made, Michelle, which is that absolutely exquisite way that the seams of the three channels in between what would be those two seams is this gorgeous fuchsia light. And then we also get that long light behind the bench where we would sit as spectators, that then does something really exciting with the quite abstracted beams of light that we get, as you describe it, characters in the beautiful interplay between the dancing figures, the movement of what we sometimes can't even make out, but that seems sort of like a figure, and then these spaces and spacings for that presence of absence. And so I wondered about your insistence on light as an agency, and wondered about a kind of dark light, a black light, that use of strobe light, lighting on smoke, that you already started to talk about the ways that someone who is not sighted or might have impaired sight might experience light. And of course, light is also an energy that traverses bodies. And so I don't know if anything from the work of Karen Barad, particularly that kind of gorgeous description about the ways that queer political imaginings might be animated in some way by she starts this piece on transmaterialities with lightning as a reaching toward, an arcing disjuncture, a striking response to charged yearnings. And while this is so much about a necropolitical environment, there also seems to be a way that light here also works in ways that resemble as so much of the space of your work does, the light of nightlife, the light of the club, the light of the underground, the light of the back rooms. So I was wondering about the agency of light here, that also seems to actually have a really strong relationship to, if not shadow, then the dark.
Yeah, maybe you can go back to one of the images of the installation. Not that one. Go to 5. Right. Okay, that's good. So yeah, there's custom lighting within the installation, and here are the 2 tubes of light that is seen with the projection, and then on the opposite wall is the seating, and there's also a light back there where you're seated. And so the light, and in fact, in this shot, this is interesting in this shot because you can see on the right and the left, there is this beam of light that is something that I edited in. And the way it's edited in this moment in the piece, the characters are really interacting with it in some way, that it becomes, it's this force. And as you say, it's energy, but it is a force, it's a presence. But it's unknowable. And in some ways, you can't even see it because it's so fleeting. And I think part of the, when you make this reference to nightlife, and so the lights move, you know, the lights kind of respond in different ways to the video. And within the realm of queer nightlife, any kind of nightlife, really, I would, you know, hey, I spent my entire 20s living in bars or working in bars. And it's a really different place when the lights come up, right? So this idea of light being a transformative agent, it may be symbolic, it may be metaphorical, but it's real. And within the world of the clubs, of course, you know, part of the reason everyone goes to clubs is to escape the mundane, to escape the world that does not want them to exist, to escape a place that does not acknowledge or respect their own identities, because their identity is outside of the mainstream in some way. And also not just as an escape, but to go somewhere to create our Xanadu, just to grab some word out of the ether there, you know, to create the world that is full of love, that is full of beauty, and a certain sort of violent beauty that becomes amplified through the layers of survival, layers of rage, layers of, you know, having to struggle and fight just to survive and be understood in the world. And to then project all of that through this magical space of the night where you can become anything you want to become for that moment in time is a really powerful place to be. And for many people, it's maybe the only place that day, that week, that month where they actually feel empowered in their lives. So that is, you know, a key relationship between light and the club space, and this this living in also inside the state of desire and the state of delirium, which is what I'm trying to recreate with this piece.
I wonder if we should play our second clip, because we have people that trickled in since, and then I will ask.
Absolutely agreed. I think that's a beautiful moment to bring that in.
Because I actually want to return to the cacophony of grief for a brief moment.
Always there.
Yes, it is.
And you can really see the role of light here as well. I have two things that I just want to say. in response to this, and they're somewhat connected, but Michelle, you can choose whichever one you want to respond to, or both. But what I love about this particularly is how it really it blurs that line between pleasure and pain, right? It's not just how sound embodies pain and then how the body in pain produces sound, but it's also there is an overall ecstasy that hinges on pleasure here as well. And I'm surprised that we've never spoken about this, but I'm thinking also about Diamanda Galas. And so I'm curious to hear if that's someone that you've been, informed by or in conversation with ever. And then I wanted to ask you about the role of gender in this, because there is this brilliant essay by Anne Carson that I reference very often, and it's titled "The Gender of Sound." And she basically talks about how the radical otherness of woman was often experienced by men through women's voices, and how the sound was unpleasant to male ears, from Greek literature to Hemingway. Like, she has an example of Hemingway broke his friendship with Gertrude Stein because he hated her laugh, and her laugh sounded like a beefsteak, I think he writes. And so female sound was considered raw and formless and disorderly and uncontrolled. Like, they were shrieking, wailing, sobbing, screaming of pain and pleasure, to the point that the Greeks had invented this like special religious ritual. I don't remember the name now, but basically it translates to women saying ugly things, and it was a space for women to just sort of yell at each other. And so thinking about Lydia and the sound in this piece, what is the role of gender, and also how is it? Can we get a little glimpse of what the next three parts are going to encompass?
Well, there's so much you just asked. Also, I just want to say, let's make sure we talk about Flucht before we move on to the Q&A. So I'm just throwing that out there so you'll remember. Okay, first, I mean, fuck Hemingway. He was a sexist pig, and everything that you've just said in terms of how, women's voices have been positioned or thought of or written about, we all know this is just patriarchal bullshit. And this is all manipulation to, take away women's power, essentially, and to otherize them, and, to make them into monsters, really. And so that's what all of that is about. And with this piece of, so of course I don't buy into any of that. And I don't even think about it when I'm making my work, because I'm just beyond that. Like, I don't want that stuff to even pollute. I think obviously women's voices are the most important things to me, and in all of their forms. And it's funny because I have a project on female rage that I started working on several decades ago that I never really completed, but it was all about women yelling at each other. It was great. I did a small version of it with two projections on opposite walls of the same person having a fight with themselves, really. And it was just kind of like, it was just like, you fucking bitch, and they were just yelling. And but when I say they, it's the same person just yelling. So the viewer's like in the middle of this fight of these two women screaming at each other, but they're the same woman. And there's so much there because because women's voices have been silenced for so long, and there's so much power there. Maybe I will, maybe that's my next project, to come back to that in a few years. So in terms of gender in this piece, well, actually the next artist who's coming, who I have confirmed, is M. Lamar. And M. Lamar, if you don't know M. Lamar's work, M. Lamar is an incredible composer, performer, visual artist who has created a whole genre of work called Negro Gothic. That is, and Lamar has really written these what he calls Negro Gothic doom spirituals. And so Lamar and we just met the other day, actually, are talking about things that they'll be doing with their voice within this piece. It's very interesting you bring up Diamanda Galás, because yes, of course, I'm inspired by Diamanda Galás. In fact, in 1982, I think, I was working at a club in Chicago, and I insisted, I brought it up to the bookers, the people who booked the club. I'm like, you have to bring in Diamanda Galás, you know, and this was a club that, you know, all of the great punk bands came through there, and they didn't know who Diamanda was, but I convinced them, and it was her first concert in Chicago. So I've been aware of her work for a very long time, find it incredibly inspiring, and come back to her quite often. And she is really a master at using her voice to excavate these dark, uncomfortable spaces of grief and, you know, genocidal histories, essentially. So the other thing I just wanted to say before we run out of time is what we're looking at right now, actually, the dancers that I worked with, you know, who are an equal part of this piece completely. The woman in this image, the head right at the very bottom of the screen, is a woman named Sigrid Lauren. And Sigrid is one half of the duo Flucht. Monica Maribel, you just saw her in the video clip at the end. She was the one doing all of these crazy movements at the end. Monica and Sigrid, for over a decade now, have had this incredible dance performance group called Flucht. And I've always admired, I've just been blown away by their work. And it was a dream of mine to work with them on something at some point in time. I wasn't friends with them. I didn't know them. And I knew I wanted to work with dancers in this piece, but I really didn't know many dancers around either. And in fact, most of my dear friends who I've collaborated with over time, who are people I go back to, have either passed away or moved. So, you know, so I was really digging to find the right people to work with, because I need to have a personal connection to the people that I work with. I'm not just casting strangers in a work. And Flucht had, like in the last year or two, Monica and Sigrid decided to go their own ways, and they each do incredible choreography and movement direction for various things. And, you know, they're still very close, but they haven't been doing a lot of Flucht performances anymore. And so I wanted to be sure I knew what I wanted them to do before asking them. And I also had to do some work to reach them, because I knew people who knew them. And that took some time. One of the people, my co-producer, Lauren Siegel, really helped me connect with Flucht. And so anyway, it wasn't until the week before I shot with Lydia in April that I brought him into my studio, presented the whole idea, talked about all these ideas, you know, started to move around the studio, and I started to try to recreate gestures I was really interested in. I mean, they do so well with these, you know, broken bodies and these extreme sharp emotional cuts from one emotional tableau to another really quickly, almost like they're being animated by some unknown force. And that is exactly what I was looking for. And so I was just blown away that they said yes, and I was so happy. And then we just started to pull together. I mean, they just sent me images of the dancers that they had worked with in the past and people they thought might be good for this project. And together we selected a group of dancers to work on this. So there is so much choreography. I mean, when you go see the show at Signs and Symbols, it is just, I mean, it is not even a fingernail full. It is like the pinpoint of how much choreography that I have, that I shot with them. And so when, for the larger project, there will be, you know, whole like 3-minute choreographic scenes on multiple screens and the dancers live in the space that will appear throughout the piece. Yeah, so I think that wraps it up.
Well, Michelle, before we shift to Q&A, I just wanted to amplify a little bit about the extent to which, as absolutely magnificently richly dense and absorbing and delirious the chapter previewed at Signs and Symbols is. And if everyone here, if you haven't yet, you must go to experience before January 20. It really is a small taste. And I know we had queued up some slides or images in this slideshow to relate the current project, 4 parts, Delirium, to a couple of other major installations, Irma Vep, The Last Breath, that shares a great deal aesthetically, one could say, and then the multi-part project, Hustlers and Empires, small piece of which you showed at Signs and Symbols in 2019. And before we shift to general questions, I wanted to say that, you know, as Michelle, an artist, a writer, a filmmaker, a thinker, someone I think of in the best possible way as maybe even embodying the title of your 2019 project at Signs and Symbols, lover, hater, cunty intellectual, what I've always wanted on my byline and everything. You've described your, what I think of as incredibly deliciously productive promiscuity in terms of a term that I adore. This is from your letter from an unknown filmmaker. You talk about yourself as the slasher. Quote, I was a slasher, a polyhyphenate, artist slash filmmaker slash writer slash performer slash photographer. Even in the mid-90s, there was no place for the polyhyphenate, no precedent. You were the freak, the outsider, the troublemaker, but thankfully computers changed all that. And, you know, computers have changed much, yes, and yet I think that there's something in this work across that speaks to a certain necessary ambition that queer transfeminist world making arguably requires being and becoming a slasher across media and form, across genres, including, you know, the live and the recorded, the manifesto, the opera, dance, monologue, song, poetry. But also I think about that deep collaboration that you were just describing with Flucht and the dancers, and insisting that you work not by casting, but you work from and with social relation. And that was a very long way of saying that I think that there's something about the scale here and the crossing that is about remaking a certain terrain that, yes, things to arc back to the beginning may require breakdown, but also assembly, maybe even in the political sense. And that might also necessarily include us as viewers who need to make our own way and arguably do so differently, having been infected in a deep way by your work that you've also described in excitingly viral. terms. So if you wanted to say something to that, what I think of as a real requirement to move across, I know I'd love to hear it, but I also want to make sure that we have space for the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jill. Yeah, when you brought up that letter, oh, that was a different letter. We were talking about censorship as well, which of course there's no time for it now, but I just thank you for that. That was such a beautiful summation. And I think, I was kind of lost looking at that last image that was on screen of Zachary and Flawless, because it just makes me want to cry. These collaborations are, you break things down. When you collaborate, you break things down and then you build them up into a new form. I mean, anyone who collaborates knows that that's usually how it works. And that is key. That is key. I was talking with Chavisa Woods, the writer and the editor for A Gathering of the Tribes. We did an interview last week, and one of the things she brought up was when you learn drawing, they teach you to draw the shadow first and to draw the darkness, and that the image will come out of that. And I thought that was a beautiful way of looking at darkness and how we deal with darkness, both through a physical and psychological sense. So I'm really still just kind of taken by that image of Zachary and Flawless. So I think we should just open it up to Q&A. Thank you, both of you, Jill and Ksenia, so much for your insights and your unending inspiration for me. Thank you.
Wow, what an incredible, brilliant conversation. I could listen to you all speaking forever, so thank you so much. We do have a few questions from the audience. And today I'm going to start with a question from GE. GE, go ahead.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you all. And thank you, Michelle, for all these many years of wonderful, astounding work. Søren wrote at one point that the faint light in each of us, which dates back to before our births, is what must be protected if we want to rejoin that remote glory with which we shall never know why we are separated. Does this in any way align with some of your work here? It seems as though it's so tightly matched to it, but maybe I'm wrong.
Absolutely. And that actually seems very hopeful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very beautiful in terms of thinking about, becoming human and landing in this world and not having any control over that, or who your parents are, where you end up living, how you end up being raised to, as soon from an early age, you really have no control over any of that. And then you can start to have agency, but yeah, to find that inner light, that original light. It's interesting because it's about seeking something that may be within you, but it's not of you. And I think that's a really powerful position to work from and try to use as an instigator in making your way through life. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, GE. And our next question will be from Anna. And Anna, I'll give you the opportunity to unmute.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just too tempted by the direction of the censorship conversation to not ask a little bit of a follow-up, because of course I've seen that go down firsthand, and I am in part asking if you might want to riff on that. on that zone, because I'm so appreciative that what your work doesn't do is accept the terms that are set from, you know, a really kind of increasingly radical right, and that your work allows us to imagine and inhabit much more free spaces. So really anything around thinking or navigating or claiming the mind space back from the sort of trolls of censorship, I'd be so grateful to hear you talk to.
Well, hi, Anna, and thank you for saying that. Yeah, refusal, right? You know, you have to stand your ground, and if your ground isn't popular, you have to stand even more firmly, and you have to continually fight for whatever small piece of ground you have, because everyone from the outside is going to try to take it away. And that's what censorship is about, clearly, right? It's about silencing people's voices. And, you know, at base level. And then of course, it, you know, as we see it happening every goddamn day within the art world in terms of, you know, the situation in the Middle East, but with the war on Gaza, it's not only about silencing, but it's about projecting a certain political position upon everyone, and that you have to subscribe to it. I mean, the most horrendous of this is what was just going on in Germany a few weeks ago, when it was announced that if you're going to get a grant in Germany or even show at any German institution, that an artist has to sign a document that says they do not believe in anti-Semitism and that their work will never engage in anti-Semitism, you know, and I'm not, you know, I am certainly anti-Semitism, but the fact that you have, you know, it's just an old story, you know, governments trying to control the work that you make, people in general, just trying to inflict their position on everyone to take away your power, you know, for what other reason other than greed and gaining more power. And if you're an artist, I mean, like myself, I've been censored many, many times in many different forms, but, you know, very directly, and works being shut down, taken down. And it's so deeply, I mean, on one level, it's so deeply hurtful on a personal level. You know, it's like someone told you they're sending your child back home from school because they don't like what they're wearing. You know, it's something that is so subjective, but it's so personal, and it's entirely political. And it's usually, it's, you know, obviously about, you know, in the art world, it's always about money. And that's always becomes the fear. And that's what Jill and I were talking about a few days ago, about an article that I wrote for a queer journal about the phantom child, and how, you know, it's always about the child. Well, we can't let children see this. And that is such a strong statement, because many people who think of themselves as liberal or left wing would agree that there are some things children shouldn't see, but no one comes up, or very few people come up and make the statement, well, what about the queer child? What do they get to see? What are you going to allow in the culture that lets them be seen and known that there are people out in the world like them, which, you know, which has been, you know, the greatest gift for me in terms of this resurgence in Blood Sisters for its 25-year anniversary, that it does speak to young queer people coming up in the world so they can see, yeah, you do have elders, and this is who they are, and this is what they were doing, you know, and this is just one slice of it. But for people who are, you know, more, let's say, radical, but I find that word radical has lost all of its meaning at this point in time. it's really hard to find those examples. So, yeah, censorship, it's just something you have to continually fight against.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that question. Thanks, Michelle, for speaking so beautifully to it. And Jill dropped some links in the chat to the article that Michelle wrote that she just mentioned, so feel free to check that out. I would like to ask you a question, Michelle. I'm curious about your choice to use black and white in your films. And yeah, if you could, I guess it had me thinking a little bit about time or maybe a resistance to a linear time, but I'm wondering if you could speak more to that.
Oh, well, it's funny. I mean, you say black and white in your films, but actually this is the first film, well, my early experimental films in the 80s and the early 90s were black and white. But then I went full on color, and it was all about like, thinking of color as darkness in some way, and how to work with color that not only contained the darkness, but also made a statement in some way in relationship to the context of whichever individual piece it was that I was talking about. But this piece is the first piece since the late 80s, early 90s, where I've actually made something in black and white. And it's interesting you bring up this idea about time, because I never thought of it that way. But my earliest influences that I can think of were that really like moved me in some way. And I knew, wow, this aesthetic is talking to me. Like, this is my core. Were silent films, and silent films like Nosferatu, Les Vampires. And then, moving on from silent films, Joan of Arc by Carl Dreyer's films, and Carl Dreyer's use of light and shadow. And as I started out making work as a photographer, I photographed everything in black and white and worked, it was all about sculpting light and shadows. Shadows were really key. And of course, all of the early horror films were the other things that just got me so excited, from the 30s and the 40s, the early Frankenstein, Dracula, all of the goth monster classics and mythological classics that were all in black and white. So that aesthetic was really important to me and key to me. But coming back here, it's really funny, but I got forced into black and white by accident. Well, maybe accident's the wrong word. But when I finished Hustlers and Empires in 2018, I was asked by a film journal, I forget which one, to do an artist spread. And so, but it turned out, and Hustlers and Empires, you showed a couple of images from it, really a lot of bright colors in that. But it turned out the publication was only going to be published in black and white. And that freaked me out at first. I was like, oh my God, it's going to be black and white. How am I going to, be happy with this and do something that's meaningful for me in black and white when these images all just sing in these saturated colors? And so as I worked through that and put together these new collage works for that and turned them all black and white, something just clicked. And had I not been put in that position for that journal, I don't know if I'd be making work in black and white right now. It just clicked though. And as I started to, then work on this project, I knew, I just knew I had to do it in black and white. And it just really, kind of came back to the early Gothic aesthetics of silent cinema as well. So, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it in time because of course, everyone knows, or if you've studied film, black and white always means we've gone back in time, or it's a flashback. It's more poetic because you've erased the representation of reality, because reality is in color. And it's, it's a tool, like beauty is a tool, like form is a tool or a weapon, a way to really make your mark and carve meaning out of imagery and light.
Wow. Thank you, Michelle.
Yes, Theta Bara. I see someone in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, there's so much to keep thinking about and ruminating on. So I'm just so grateful for the chance to have heard you speak more about your work. And I just wanted to swing it back to Jill and Ksenia, if there's any final words or questions that you'd like to share before we conclude today.
Can I ask one more question? Do we have time?
Yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
I have one, Jill. Do you? If well,
Go ahead. I mean, I always have more questions.
I know,
but please go.
you're a good pair in that. Michelle, I am curious, what would the ideal venue be for the final product?
Oh, I know my ideal venue, but I'm just going to shout it out right here. My ideal venue is the Park Avenue Armory. That would be my ideal venue. A large, impressive, and imposing architectural space.
I can see it and feel it already.
Yes, that has its own agency and in its own perspective and its own position in some way, the building itself, and large enough to house 6 large projections, along with platforms and places for the performers to move.
Excellent. Let's make it happen.
Yeah. Can you make that
Park
happen,
Avenue
please?
Armory, 2025, 26. We're all there.
Thank you.
I mean, I know I had wanted to ask you about making space to not just think about that which has died, but to hold it. But I feel like that making space for that also becoming delirious and with the presence of absence feels like it's calling for something like the Park Avenue Armory, which also has its ghosts that that ever presence of war feels, I mean, the armory, it feels like just the right place.
Definitely. I can see it. I hope to see it in real physical form one day soon.
Yeah, short of the armory. There's a couple of other spaces in mind. Any space large enough to really contain the multiple projections and movement, and to have viewers be able to move in position. I don't like the proscenium stage relationship, and that's part of why I got away from single channel video work. I'm really interested in physicality and the viewers being physically engaged and imposed upon by a cinematic experience.
Yeah, incredible. Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you so much, Jill and Ksenia. This has been a really, really, really incredible conversation. And definitely please go see this show before it closes. And I would also like to thank Bridget and the team at Signs and Symbols for supporting with the preparations for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and for making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And please join us on Monday for a virtual screening of King in the Wilderness in honor of MLK Day. There is a link to register for that screening on our events page, and there will be a link to that in the chat. Thank you all so much again for a really wonderful afternoon and for tuning in. And you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Hope you all have really lovely weekends, and thank you so much again.
So
Thanks.
great to be with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Michelle.
Thank you.
Love you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Love you
Thank you.
all.
Thank you.
Bye, Michelle.
Beautiful.